Welcome to Geopolitical Horizon. Today I'm going to provide part 2 of the 3-part series focusing on U.S. strategy internationally. But first, remember to hit subscribe and hit the bell, and you'll receive videos every Wednesday. And on Fridays, African Horizon provides videos, and on Mondays, Asian Horizon provides videos. So you'll be staying up to date with geopolitical videos every week. You'll be staying informed, so remember to subscribe. Now to U.S. strategy. Today I'm going to be focusing and analyzing, how U.S. governments use sanctions internationally, to challenge countries in order to what the U.S. governments, really think is, to sway their policies and sway their thinking. Now, I think that, consecutive administrations in the United States, by using sanctions, it is really preventing U.S. policies, and it's really preventing the United States from accomplishing what I really think the United States would like to do. The U.S. being the leading superpower since the end of the Cold War for the last 30 years, now is challenged by the rise of China. So, while the United States, I think, should have implemented policies really to maintain its global position and to maintain strong and vital trade relations with countries around the world, I think that the usage of sanctions is going to challenge and hamper the U.S. position in the future. And I'm going to explain why. Various countries that, the U.S. uses sanctions against, they're now changing and thinking about how to, improve trade relations with other countries. So, for example, look at Iran. Iran just entered into a strategic agreement with China after, the United States, imposing sanctions on Iran for years. Same with Russia. Russia is increasing its relationship with China. The United States imposing sanctions on Russia. The U.S. government, constantly criticizing Russia and challenging Russia. I think these policies of using sanctions against various governments, around the world, I think is going to sway countries to move from relations with the United States to increasing their relations with China and other countries. And now we must remember, trade is the new security paradigm. Infrastructure and trade corridors and economic corridors, that is the new security paradigm of the future. Therefore, while the United States, historically has been using enormous defense budgets to have the strongest military, which it still does, in the future, I think more importantly, it's going to be to strengthen trade relations, build economic corridors, invest in various regions like China is doing very strategically. The United States could have done so. As I provided and examined in the first part of the U.S. strategy series, I examined and explained how I think the U.S. government now should invest heavily in Central America as part of the American Jobs Plan. But when I was reading the American Jobs Plan last week, I didn't see a word on international investments. I didn't see a word about investing in Central America. But imagine if the U.S. government had invested heavily in Central America and made Central America into a growth region, an economic hub, a growth center. That would have been, very positive for the United States. However, currently, countries in Central America are really struggling, dealing with corruption, high crime rates, gang violence, instability. Therefore, we're seeing thousands and thousands of refugees flowing to the U.S. border, in Texas. Therefore, again, I think, now thinking more strategically, the U.S. government should change its policy, should change its thinking, because sanctions in the future is going to hamper the U.S. from maintaining its international position as the leading country. I think instead, if the United States had really recalibrated its strategic considerations in terms of developing relations with Iran, developing relations with Russia, strengthening relations with China, I think that would have been much wiser. Now, of course, there are challenges in bilateral relations, and that is understandable. Russia understands that, China understands that, Iran understands that, and other countries understand that. But still, it is much better to improve trade relations, because then you can increase trade, you can increase imports and exports, you can increase, business relationships, and the human-to-human interaction, business people interacting with business people, tradesmen interacting with tradespeople, business associations increasing their relationships with chambers of commerce, business associations. I think it's going to be very important for the United States in the coming years and the coming decades. In order for the US to maintain its international position, it should, recalibrate its strategic thinking and diminish in large parts the usage of sanctions, strengthen trade relations, really strengthen its internal manufacturing capacity, its internal industrial strategy, to really strengthen its industrial and trade potential globally. That, I think, would have been a strategic recalibration for the United States worldwide, which would have shifted also how many other countries perceive, I think, the United States. Because the United States is an enormous country, it has great potential, great variations in terms of culture, in terms of people, in terms of the landscape of the United States, from coast to coast, the urban centers, from New York to Los Angeles, Chicago to Washington, D.C. to Seattle. And the United States is a vast country with enormous potential, but currently also internally in the United States, with the COVID pandemic being raging now, over 500,000 people dead, millions and millions and millions of people infected, the internal situation, in terms of the race relations in the United States, the George Floyd case ongoing in the media. The United States has a lot of internal challenges, but the question is, how can the United States strategically, internationally maintain its position? Well, if the US government continues to impose sanctions on other countries, like we've seen with Iran, with Russia, with China, even with Germany because of Nord Stream 2, and Turkey because of the potential use, purchase of S-400, which Turkey is now doing. The US government may even consider imposing sanctions on India because India is also buying S-400 from Russia. These, sanctions, being imposed on various countries, even allies, I don't think it's necessarily going to improve US relations with other countries. And the United States, even if it is the superpower, needs good relations with neighbors, with allies, and even with potential competitors. So I think that in the US administration or President Joe Biden and future presidents should really rethink if it is so smart and wise to use sanctions when we see that countries, really change their focus towards China and other countries. So I think that's going to be really important, and that's what I wanted to focus on today, because I think that US sanctions, internationally, are hampering relations with other countries. And these are countries that, the United States could have had great relations with, could have had strong trade relations, could have had really bilateral relations that would have been really positive for the United States and for these countries. Because a lot of countries want to trade with the United States, but when they are receiving sanctions, they can't trade with the United States. So I think this is really something to reflect on. And, this is also impacting European companies because in terms of, for example, Iran, when the US imposes sanctions on Iran, that is affecting European companies that are so strongly linked with companies in the US and the US financial system. So I think in the future, for the US to really, maintain its position as the leading country, and I think it's going to be really important to change its sanctions policy. So that is just one aspect, of course, impacting whether the US will maintain its position. The other is, as I was referring to earlier in the video, in terms of investments in trade corridors, in infrastructure, and building trade alliances, and really for the US government to really strengthen its capacity and ability to invest in infrastructure corridors like China is doing. That is going to be really important. But then the US needs to maintain good relations with countries in order to be able to do that. Because when you build trade corridors, when you build infrastructure, when you build industrial projects in countries, you need to operate on the ground. And in order to operate on the ground, you need to have good relations with people in the countries, with stakeholders, with local communities, with the governments. Therefore, changing the use of sanctions in US policies is one of the aspects that I think will recalibrate the United States relationship with countries worldwide going forward. So that's something to think about. Well, welcome back next Wednesday, and remember to subscribe to Geopolitical Horizon, and thank you so much for joining.